My name's Dana Flightman. Like you said, I'm the senior training and awareness specialist at the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And today, as you might have deduced, we will be talking about stalking, specifically how stalking relates to sexual violence, sexual assault, and other forms of sexual violence as well. And so I often, I do training all across the country for audiences, including victim service professionals, law enforcement officers, campus professionals, prosecutors, really anyone on the criminal justice and or victim service side of recognizing and responding to stalking. And I usually start by asking this question, which is, for how many folks is this the first time they've had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking? And usually it's half to the whole room. And that's not a reflection on anyone in the field, but it is a reflection that stalking is very undertrained in our area. And we want to remember there are four major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, but it's always kind of like and stalking. Like we almost call their website andstalking.org because so often it's like, oh yeah, and stalking, we kind of cover that too. It's like in the mix with the other stuff. But the reality is that stalking is a prevalent victimization in its own right, as well as one that often co-occurs with others. It is something that is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous, but it's very under-resourced. When you think about it, there is no national stalking hotline. There are few, if any, standalone stalking crisis centers. And so it really falls to folks like you, who are often primarily focused on sexual or intimate partner violence, to kind of add stalking on. And I'm not saying that's fair or easy because those are already big victimizations with plenty of work to do. But it is really important because there is no one else. There's nowhere else for these victims to go. And so, look, you're the ones doing the work on the ground every day. You know how to do what you do. My hopes is by the end of the session, you'll kind of move that and stalking a little more to the beginning of the sentence and see some of the work that you're already doing so well through that lens with some new tools, resources, and frameworks. So we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, and we are the technical assistance provider on stalking. What that means is that we're here to help the helpers, and y'all are the helpers. And so if you would like further training on stalking, a resource that you're not seeing on our website, if you're working with a specific victim or survivor and just want to talk it through with somebody, we can offer all that usually for free because that's what we're funded to do. Our website, which I'll refer to throughout this, is stalkingawareness.org. There we have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have a section for victim services, for law enforcement, for campus professionals, for awareness educators. And speaking of awareness educators, if you or your partners do any kind of education on, say, consent, bystander intervention, healthy relationships, you want to be talking stalking as well. And so we have programs on our website that you can pick up and lead with scripts and slides and videos. We have discussion guides on every season of the TV show You, that I'm working on the finale season right now because it just came out 2 weeks ago. Um, that's a great way to get people talking stalking, and other strategies, including if you don't have time for a standalone, I have my unofficial Sister Can You Spare a Slide campaign that's like, here's your one slide just to put on stalking in your, say, dating abuse presentation. So I hope that you will check those out. We have victim resources, so we are not a direct service provider, but we know victims come to us for information and resources. So we try to share resources that y'all can easily share with victims. For example, we have these brochures you can order for free on our website in English and Spanish on what is stalking. You can put your local information here. So if you have something to hand your survivor of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, make sure you have something for your stalking survivor as well. We also have a handbook translated into 10 languages, fact sheets, infographics, lots of stuff like that, and webinars. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you are in luck, my friends, because we have an archive of recorded webinars and we're called Spark. So I got us to call it the Sparchives. So that was like the height of my career. So you can check us out in the Sparchives anytime. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is at follow us legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at Spark, we will not be scared. We want you to follow us. Um, and sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking organization, we will not contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually like opt into our newsletter, and it's one we send around quarterly. It's not one of those you're getting all the time. So I hope that you will connect with us during and after this webinar. And the website is so much stuff: e-learning modules, infographics, detailed guides, one pagers, just a ton of stuff. So I hope that those will be helpful for you. So why learn about stalking besides it's one of those four VAWA crimes? Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It's a crime at the federal level in all 50 states, including, of course, the state of Oregon, as well as the District of Columbia and U.S. territories. It's a crime in most tribal lands and in the military justice system. It also violates campus policy, right? And is one of the reportable offenses under the Clery Act. So it is a crime across the board. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is actually criminal. So you have victims saying, well, what, should I call the police because somebody's ringing my doorbell or driving by my home? And of course, a lot goes into a victim's decision to engage with law enforcement or not, but a lot of them don't even realize that's an option because they don't recognize what's happening is stalking, and further, that stalking is a crime. And it's traumatic. Many stalking victims experience mental and physical health issues that can be short-term to lifelong, particularly anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal ideation. And what's maybe a little bit unique to stalking is that sense of anticipatory fear, that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And we have stalking survivors feel like that sometimes for years. And so you could imagine how that sense of it's never really over, they can always come back. I'm always checking my surroundings. I don't, Mother's Day is coming up. I'm going to get a creepy card in the mail. Like there'll be some reminder of this person, or they might come back and escalate. You can imagine the kind of hypervigilance that often results and the kind of trauma that often results. Many lose time from work. 1 in 8 employed stalking victims lose some time. Um, Many lose, that's usually 5 days or more. And stalking survivors are not always a protected class of worker. And so that's worth checking in your jurisdiction to see because they might lose their jobs entirely. They don't always get the same protections as domestic violence victims. And quite a few relocate. This really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited and it's a positive thing in your life, it's stressful, it's expensive, it's not something you do because someone's kind of annoying you. We have 1 in 7 victims relocating to get away from these offenders, which I think helps to illustrate how consuming and traumatic this victimization can be. Always good to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's one who said, it's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there. And like I said, with that anticipatory fear, I like this quote because it illustrates what so many survivors have said to me, that sense that it's never really over. And in fact, the average duration of a stalking case, not the high end, this really surprised me when I learned this. The average duration of a stalking case is 2 years, and 10% of cases last 5 years or more. So a stalking case can last from one afternoon to an entire lifetime. There's a huge variety there, but you could imagine that kind of hypervigilance and the trauma from these continuing. This person keeps coming back and they won't leave me alone, and I don't know what they'll do next. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including rape. And of course, we'll talk about that in more detail in this webinar. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. And yet, so often these stalking behaviors are dismissed or minimized as, oh, it's texting, it's following, it's just stalking. It's annoying, but no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. These behaviors and tactics adding up and escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying every stalking case escalates to the point of violence or homicide, right? That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week I read cases of violence, attempted violence, homicide, attempted homicide, and at that point, responders are often looking backwards and saying, oh, look, there's this whole history of stalking victimization here. Often that was reported to multiple sources, but was not handled with the urgency that it deserved. So we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to wait for violence and then say, oh, the stalking was happening all along. No, we want to identify the stalking while it's happening and intervene then, because this is one of the few victimizations where that early identification and intervention can help prevent further trauma, violence, sexual violence, possibly even homicide. All right, so I'm saying stalking so bad we have to do something. What is it exactly? And if you haven't had prior training on stalking, I will unsurprisingly say you should do that. And that we have a ton of stuff on our website about it. But just to kind of ground everyone in kind of the same starting point here, here's at least what will feel to me like the quick version of what is stalking? What am I talking about? Now, of course, depends who you ask, right? Are we talking about our statute? Are we talking about an organization's policy? Are we talking about the behavioral definition? I will go over your statute briefly, but I want to start with the behavioral definition. And sometimes my criminal justice folks are annoyed by that because they're like, I don't care what this is in theory. Like, can I charge it? Yes or no? But I think regardless of your role, and I know we have people in different professions here, which is great. You know, it's important to know that behavioral definition because even if you need to tell a victim stalking will not be the most strategic charge in the situation from a criminal justice perspective, you still want to know when behaviorally what's happening is stalking, because that's going to help you best safety plan with that victim, identify the urgency of the situation, and connect them to the most relevant resources. So behaviorally, and by the way, for campus folks, this is the same as your campus definition. Stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break that down a little bit, it is a pattern of behavior. So that's not a single incident or one-off event. And that's called a course of conduct in most statutes and policies. So you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. It's two or more behaviors that make up that pattern. Um, and those behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking you because I'm the worst presenter ever. Okay. So maybe Monday I text you, Tuesday I'm mad you didn't respond, I smash your headlights on your car. Then Wednesday I feel kind of bad about that, so I send you flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, right? So stalkers often combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like that property damage, with other behaviors that may not be criminal on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So that's confusing because it's not illegal to send someone flowers, but it is illegal to stalk somebody. It's also confusing because our system tends to be pretty incident based. That's certainly true where our officers are responding to a call for service. But even on the victim service side, sometimes we focus on that incident that brought that victim in today, right? And so I encourage you to, if a victim's telling you about an incident, to zoom out and be thinking, is this an isolated incident? Is it part of a bigger pattern of behavior? Because that victim who's telling you about, say, their smashed headlight may or may not think to automatically disclose to you, oh, I think I know who did this, and they've been sending me weird messages lately, like on my phone. And I've gotten some weird stuff in the mail lately. I think they might have sent it. Or they keep ringing my doorbell or coming by the house, right? Like these are things they may or may not think to automatically share because they might be thinking, well, that's not relevant. That's not what we're talking about. But it needs to be because it's letting you know this is not an isolated incident. It's part of a bigger pattern of behavior. Stalking also is directed at a specific person or persons. So if you had, say, a peeping Tom in the locker room, that might still be a crime. It's not really stalking unless they're watching a woman in there and then following and then doing something else because we need two or more, following her out, contacting her, etc. So it's not just random, it's they are selecting individuals, often based on their perceived vulnerability, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking, and it's actually what separates it. And I'm talking behaviorally here. Your statutes are a little bit different. It's a little confusing, but behaviorally, stalking is different because it's about fear, which is a little different than harassment, which is typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel frustrated, annoyed, disrespected. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So if my supervisor is emailing me at 3 a.m. and then calling me names at the staff meeting at 9 in front of everyone, like she's terrible and I hate her. I'm not necessarily afraid of her. I can more or less live a normal life, but I'm like, ugh, like that's disrespectful. I don't deserve to be treated like that. But let's say that I'm driving home. I think I see her car a couple back. She texts me a picture of myself walking my pug, says, "Why are you doing that instead of working?" She emails my husband. I don't know how she got his email. Now I'm scared, right? Because I'm like, what part of my life is separate from this person? Like, is she gonna hurt me or something? Like, I don't, what is going on? She has invaded all these aspects of my life. And so harassment can become stalking or kind of be part of the course of conduct, but they're a little bit distinct behaviorally. And I think that's important because when the charges line up, stalking is a higher charge than harassment typically. So we want to acknowledge that and have that accountability. And also because our stalking victims are at greater risk of violence than our harassment victims. So we want to call it what it is and respond with the right safety planning tools, risk assessment tools, and urgency there, right? When we see our stalking survivors. And so again, stalking is about fear, but fear of what? People are afraid of different things. And so our behavioral definition includes fear of bodily harm, right? Safety or safety of others, as well as emotional distress. And emotional distress is also about fear. It's just recognizing that fear may be of outcomes in place of or in addition to physical violence. So you might be afraid of losing custody of your children or of never having a private moment again. And people experiencing emotional distress, it's not just having a bad day or being frustrated. They typically feel that they are under surveillance, that their life is being invaded, that they're being sabotaged, that they're being threatened and intimidated. The best quote that I saw about it was a victim who said, "It's like he's taken my life without killing me." So that sense of I cannot live a normal life because of the interference from the stalker and what they might do next. So for example, there was a case where an offender had hacked into the victim's email and so was watching everything that she sent, and she was applying for new jobs. And so he used some AI software to create nude images of her, kind of photoshopped her into pornography, wrote a bunch of lies about what she liked sexually. Every time she applied for a new job, he would then follow up with that HR manager with that image and those rumors. He then went on LinkedIn and would contact all the potential colleagues with that same information. And so that's beyond like, oh, people gossip or that sounds annoying, right? That's scary. That is something where this person cannot live a normal life. And she might say, well, he never hurt me physically, but I would still say that sounds like stalking behavior, right? And so, again, behaviorally here, thinking through that, if it's about fear, it's and not being able to live a normal existence, that's probably stalking. And that context is really critical in stalking cases. It's often everything in stalking cases because often what's scariest to a victim or survivor may seem benign or kind of nice to an outsider. So, for example, there was a case where the victim did call law enforcement, and all she'd say was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." And understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team. They're kind of like, "Okay, lady," And eventually she calmed down enough and said, "He's here." So it turned out it was a stalking survivor who had relocated to get away from the offender, address confidentiality, new job, really thought she'd covered her tracks, got off socials, everything. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see you, unfortunately, because of the webinar format, but typically when I tell that story in person, I get kind of like a ugh, right? Because it's scary, because a reasonable person would feel fear. It's really scary when we know the context. But if all we see is this object of a cup of coffee in the car, we're like, I wish my car did that. Why are you upset? And so we need to dig a little deeper to understand what's going on with our victims and survivors. And so something may be scary to the victim, but not to you as the responder. And so what you want to do there is ask them some follow-up questions respectfully, right? Ask them questions like, what message did that send to you? What is the story behind that? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic, albeit an extreme example, is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you. So victim gets flowers, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, that's so lovely, because they don't know about that specific meaning. And so it's stalking that it's context that makes stalking scary, and it's context that makes stalking stalking because generally no one thing is stalking, right? Again, we have to zoom out and say, well, what else is going on? How are these incidents connecting? And it's criminalizing otherwise non-criminal behaviors. It's not generally a crime to send someone roses. It generally is a crime to make a credible threat to kill somebody. So when one means the other, we have to do some digging and explaining because this is how stalkers get away with their behavior. You have responders saying, well, flowers aren't threats. Well, not always, but they can be. It all depends on the context. And stalking is typically a really personal and highly contextual crime. And so we have to really be looking at that to understand the full scope of danger and harm. So, fear of what, right? People are afraid of different things. For our purposes today and the focus on sexual violence, I think it's worth pointing out that fear of sexual assault is covered under most, if not all, stalking statutes. Some don't include emotional distress, like there's you want to talk stalking statutes, we can do it, but that they're different in scope. And again, I will go over the Oregon one in just a second, but even a narrow stalking statute that's limited to physical harm, sexual assault is physical harm. And so if someone is afraid of sexual assault, I would argue that that is more likely to be stalking, or at least I would consider, is this stalking versus harassment? Because if there's fear of that violence, um, then that is certainly, part of a stalking case. And the fears may be of sexual assault itself, but if we're thinking about behaviorally what stalking is and the other kinds of sexual fears that might be happening, it could be these other things as well, like voyeurism or privacy invasion. They're going to watch me through the window, they're going to film me without my consent. Often stalkers threaten to harm other people close to the victim. So they could be doing that, I'll come for your sister, I'll come for this person. Intimate photos or videos being created and or shared, um, or sharing personal sexual information or spreading rumors. All of these things are scary, right? And so all of these fears may be part of a stalking case as well. I just want to highlight this is the federal definition on sexual harassment. And so it's similar, but it's about that hostile or offensive work environment, like I said, requests for sexual favors, verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. And so I bring this up just because I think that often I see things described as sexual harassment cases, and I'm like, is that or is that stalking? Again, at the point when there's fear of sexual assault, we might actually be looking at a stalking case. And so, of course, we want to respond to our harassment cases with urgency as well. I'm not trying to minimize harassment in any ways, but I just encourage you to think through, what are the facts of the situation? Is this harassment? Could it be stalking? Is there fear here? And I think that often gets left out. There's a lot of training on sexual harassment, that's great, but there's not a lot on stalking or when it might cross that line. And so that's worth thinking about. So as promised, the Oregon statute. So I am not an attorney, but I am surrounded by them at work. Aren't you jealous? So This is a very quick overview, and we have more guidance on the statute on our website, and or you can reach out to our attorneys. I'll connect you with them at Equitas, and they can give you a deeper dive on the statute. And if we have attorneys in here, I see some folks from the law center, etc. Please feel free to chime in because you know your statute better than I do. I just want to really high level point out some of the similarities and differences behaviorally slash on campus versus okay, now your victim is working with the criminal justice system, it might look a little bit different. And so the Oregon statute, stalking, person knowingly alarms or coerces another person, repeated and unwanted contact. So there's already a couple differences here. One is knowingly, right? We have to show our offender knew or should have known what they were doing was scary. And so, of course, our stalkers will say, oh, I wasn't trying to scare them. I just sent those death threats because I thought it was hilarious or whatever. So we have to show, no, you knew or should have known what you were doing was scary. And there's an intent requirement in most crimes. So this isn't, well, no, I don't know, most crimes, in many crimes. So that's not that unusual. Um, and so one helpful thing you can do is that kind of knock it off to your offender through law enforcement. Let them know you are making the victim afraid. Stop this contact. Document that warning because if they continue, it's hard to argue, oh, I didn't know. I didn't mean to. I wasn't aware that I was scaring or coercing that person, right? Because it's like, but you did know because we told you and you still continued. Um, that being said, that can also escalate the situation, right? When there's that it's the same as like a protective order being served. When we have that official getting involved and saying, hey, knock it off, that offender might escalate their behavior. And so you want to ask victims how they think the stalker will react. Some will say, ooh, they do not want to get in trouble. They will be so embarrassed, they will back off. Great. Some will say, ooh, that'll only make things worse. Okay, less great, right? So we want to know that and what the victim's priorities are. So that isn't an always or never kind of situation, but it's something to consider because we do need to show that our offender knew or should have known what they were doing was scary. That being said, that is, stalkers do know what they're doing is scary. And there's other ways to show that. For example, if our victim blocked them on everything and they still keep contacting them, you know that's alarming, right? You know that's alarming or coercive. It's not respecting of the boundary. So anyways, if there's criminal justice folks who want to talk about that more, happy to do so. But just want to highlight that intent piece because that is important here. Um, and so scares who? The victim or victim's immediate family or household, repeated and unwanted contact. So, okay, more than once. It's reasonable if the person's scared. Okay, reasonable person standard. That's the same as our behavioral definition. Um, and here's where it gets a little more narrow. Reasonable apprehension regarding the victim's personal safety of the victim or the member of the household. And so I talked to our attorneys a little bit, and they agreed that this doesn't seem to necessarily include emotional distress. And so if you have a victim saying, well, I think they follow me everywhere and they're in all my accounts and I can never have a moment alone and I'm terrified, but I don't think they'd ever hurt me. I don't think I'm unsafe. That might be a difficult stalking case. Again, deferring to your attorneys and law enforcement on the ground. And so the behavioral definition more explicitly includes emotional distress, and your statute is a little more narrow and more focused on bodily harm. It's a class A misdemeanor, but there are some aggravating factors that bring it up to a felony if they have a prior conviction for stalking or if they violate the court stalking protective order. And so stalkers are often repeat offenders with a high rate of recidivism. So sometimes we hear folks say like, well, what's the point? It's just this little misdemeanor. Well, when they do it again, it becomes a felony. So that's worth considering. I pulled your harassment statute because it also speaks to sexual violence and it's a little bit unique. And so it's harassment if they harass or annoy the other person by offensive physical contact, which is interesting because I feel like usually when there's physical contact, it's more of an assault, um, or they're trying to evoke violence. They're trying to provoke violence. Could also be false report, and they talk about that a threat to inflict serious injury or commit a felony. So this is a little tricky to me, honestly, because if someone makes a threat of, say, sexual violence, I'd say, well, then wouldn't you be afraid of sexual violence? And then wouldn't that be stalking? So again, here's where your attorneys can come into play here. But I just want to point out that you do have these two different statutes that can be helpful, right? And so you'll want to talk to and give that kind of a menu of options and see what makes the most sense. Um, this is a class A, it becomes a class A misdemeanor if they actually physically contact the person, or if it's of a sexual nature. And so, really long story short, and I'm sorry to be kind of muddied in here, again, not an attorney, but I want to highlight that big picture. If you're like, this is boring, what are we talking about? The point is your Oregon statute's a little more narrow than our behavioral definition. It may or may not include emotional distress, but you have options here. We need to show the intent, and we will be thinking about what kind of threats were made, what kinds of fear was there, and that will help you decide from a criminal justice perspective, is it strategic to do a harassment or a stalking charge, or something else, right? Either way, though, I hope that you'll recognize behaviorally when there's that fear that it is stalking and respond to victims with that in mind. All right, so stalking and sexual assault. These victimizations also have a lot in common. And I find it's a helpful starting point because folks tend to know a little bit more about sexual assault. So, what is this myth of the stranger offender? These are image results for the word stalking. And so, as you can see, it's a lot of alleyways, hoodies, kind of faceless figures. And it's very similar to the myth of the stranger rapist, right? That sense that someone's going to come out of the alley or out of the bushes, that we've never seen before and commit this assault. And that can happen, right? There are stranger offenders for both stalking and sexual violence, but those are by far the minority of cases. And this is tricky because just like with sexual assault, you have victims saying things like, well, I don't think this was really a crime or anything. This wasn't really stalking. This wasn't really rape because I know that person. Or, oh no, that's just an ex having a hard time getting over things. Um, when that's a major category of stalking offender, right? So over 40% of the time for our female victims, about a third of the time for our male victims, that stalker is a current or former intimate partner. Um, and so that's a big piece of it, right? That intimate partner stalking. Um, but it also means if 30 to 40% of the time it's an intimate partner, that means 60 to 70% of the time it's not, right? It might be an acquaintance. It could be a stranger, though it's relatively rare. It might be a brief encounter, like, oh, I met them at that party once, or I think they work at that coffee shop. It could be a family member or a person of authority. That could be a supervisor, academic advisor, law enforcement officer, somebody with some kind of power over that victim. And so I encourage you, and I know we have folks sitting in different kinds of roles and offices here, but to think about, are you, when you serve stalking victims, are you serving intimate partner and non-intimate partner? And if you're not, you know where to refer them. And if you are, that's great, but would they know how to find you? Because if I'm being stalked by, say, an estranged friend or a neighbor, and there was never a sexual relationship, it's not that intuitive for me to pick up the phone and call the domestic violence shelter, right? Or the rape crisis, because like that's not what I'm experiencing. And yet that's where folks like you are who can actually help and assist victims of stalking. And again, there's no stalking crisis center. And so thinking about things like, is the word stalking on your website? If you have stalking brochures, if you have brochures on domestic and sexual violence, um, are your staff trained on stalking? Those kinds of things can really help. And of course, we have all that stuff on our website. Um, but again, just to highlight that, similar to sexual assault, people have the sense that it's these strangers, and there's this kind of specific image of what that looks like, and that's not actually the reality of who the perpetrator is. And just like with sexual assault, this has real impacts on reporting and help seeking. Research suggests that victims rely on notions of what a real or legitimate crime looks like. And so if you look at this slide and these two potential offenders, like which one looks like a stalker, I'm going to go with Mr. Trenchcoat, right? That guy looks shady. But we know that actually our intimate partners and our friends are more likely to stalk us. And on average, they tend to be the most threatening and violent. The people that we know or knew the best tend to cause the most harm. Um, and I can just tell you anecdotally, you know, There's a stalking survivor I'm thinking of who was stalked twice in her life, totally separate incidents, was just unlucky twice. And one time the offender was a homeless man with mental health issues in her neighborhood, and the other time it was an ex-husband. Guess which one got the more urgent response? Right? It was the homeless man in the neighborhood, but when she was afraid for her life, it was the ex-husband stalker. And so these kinds of myths and misperceptions can affect how we view the urgency around stalking cases as well as our victim reporting. And victims are scared when someone they know is stalking them, but they're more likely to report feeling fearful, but less likely to report to police. And I don't think there's any one reason for this, but to me, it points to the idea of I'm experiencing something really scary and it doesn't match the story of who a stalker is. And I think we see this same problem with sexual assault, right? Well, that's not rape because I know that person or we consented in the past or etc. So we see that same dynamic playing out here. Both of these are prevalent victimizations, depends what study you look at. Both are showing around 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking and the same numbers for contact sexual violence. And so the numbers are right up there in terms of stalking prevalence, right? And these are both really prevalent victimizations that need more resources and more and to be addressed a bit more. But we rarely hear about stalking kind of mentioned at the same level. And our victims of stalking and sexual violence experience similar types of victim blaming. And so while we certainly have more room for improvement around victim blaming for sexual violence, to say the least. I find that it's a little more readily identified, perhaps, than our stalking victim blaming when we're really telling people pretty much the same thing. This sense of, well, were you clear that you didn't like the attention? What did you do to fight this person off and or avoid them? Um, how did you why if you didn't want that attention, why did you share this information or talk to this person or etc. And at the risk of sounding overly twee, I feel like the what did you share has become the new what did you wear, where especially through technology we end up asking our victims, well, if you didn't want to be found, why did you share your location on that social media app? Okay, just like with sexual violence, we can do risk reduction planning, right? We can talk about safety planning, et cetera, and risk reduction. But at the end of the day, um, sharing your location on Instagram or what have you does not cause stalking. Stalkers cause stalking, right? The problem is that a stalker saw that information and chose to use that to show up and cause harm, right? And felt the entitlement and that sense of, oh, I see where they are. I'm going to go to them and stalk them. That is their responsibility. The victim is not responsible for that behavior. And so I think sometimes with the technology and different generational aspects, that can kind of muddy things where people feel like, but don't share that if you don't want people finding you. And again, we can talk about risk reduction, but nothing that a victim shares or doesn't share or does or doesn't do um, is a justification for the offender stalking them. That's still their responsibility. But we hear a lot of the same sort of victim blaming attitudes. So stalking and sexual assault specifically, um, often co-occur. So this was a survey of young adults ages 18 to 24 who identified as sexual assault survivors, and it simply asked them, have you been stalked as well? Nearly half are saying yes. And so we know these victimizations often go hand in hand, and that a lot of our victims are experiencing both. So stalking and sexual violence a little more broadly, there's a lot of ways this can intersect. And I think a helpful starting point here is to look at what we call our SLY framework, which we like, that is really about the diversity of stalking behaviors. Because when a lot of folks think about stalking, they think surveillance. So you get this imagery of like the camera or binoculars, but anything scary that's not the first thing that happened could be a stalking case. And so that's a wide variety of behaviors. Um, and all of these can be sexually violent and or threatening as well, right, within these different categories. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How is someone tracking, following, watching, gathering information about the victim? Life invasion is how is that stalker showing up in the victim's life where the victim doesn't want them to be there? So that could be excessive contact, showing up in person, just this constant trying to get to you, trying to get to you. Intimidation, explicitly or implicitly, how are they intimidating that victim? Those could be direct threats, as well as symbolic violence. And interference through sabotage or attack. How are they actually harming this person and changing their life and interfering with their life? So we're going to watch a short video that goes through, review some of the information I've mentioned so far, um, and then talk about these four categories with some examples of sexually violent stalking behaviors for each.
There are four major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act: domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So, how do sexual assault, or sexual violence more broadly, and stalking intersect? Victims who were stalked by an abusive intimate partner were more likely to experience multiple forms of sexual violence than those abused but not stalked, including sexual degradation, substance use, and penetration while sleeping. About 1 in 3 women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. And about half of sexual assault survivors said they experienced stalking as well. But remember that stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So, fear or emotional distress about what? Many stalking victims and survivors are afraid of sexual violence. In fact, while stalking statutes vary across the country, most include fear of sexual violence. Every category of stalking behavior, surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference through sabotage or attack, can include tactics that are sexually violent in nature. Surveillance behaviors may include voyeurism, whether in person or by accessing or planting recording devices. Surveillance may also include gathering information about the victim, either through technology, asking mutual acquaintances, or other means. That information might include researching and selecting victims based on their perceived vulnerabilities, disabilities, or lack of credibility, or finding out when a chosen victim is alone or isolated to commit the sexual violence. Stalkers may also gather information for later blackmail or extortion, or the monitoring might happen after the violence to see if the victim is telling anyone about what has happened. Stalkers may also engage in life invasion, showing up in the victim's life when the victim doesn't want them to be there, through leaving sexual items or gifts, excessive contact of a sexual nature, and or spreading sexual rumors or information about a victim to others. Many stalkers intimidate their victims through both direct and indirect threats. These could be threats to share sexual images or information, engaging in symbolic sexual violence like cutting underwear or stealing intimate items, threatening to sexually harm the victim or those the victim cares about, or coercing or threatening the victim into sexual acts. Interference through sabotage or attack may include tampering with or stealing birth control, posting or sharing intimate images of the victim, spreading sexual rumors, impersonating a victim online to set them up for sexual violence, or actually committing a sexual attack. When you're working with a victim of sexual violence or intimate partner violence, be sure to ask about stalking victimization.
Right. I will stop it there. But yeah, just a lot of examples, and we have this video on our website as well as some one-pagers that include all of that as well. But just to be thinking about if there's this kind of threats of sexual violence in different ways, this could be part of a stalking case as well. So when we think about intersections, and this was mentioned briefly in the video, there could be a few ways that happens. It could be that the stalker is threatening or planning sexual violence. So before the assault, or before the act of violence, they are either trying to see who seems vulnerable, like we saw in the video where someone's looking through dating profiles, seeing who seems new to town, right? Or they could be planning sexual violence. They've chosen a target and they're trying to assess, when is this person alone? When are they vulnerable? When can I access them? They might try to get someone else to sexually assault the victim or be sexually violent towards them, so that third party. They might commit sexual violence at any time, or sometimes it's that contact after to intimidate them. So we're going to look at a few examples of each of these. So stalking to commit sexual violence. Here's a quick news clip that illustrates this. this stalking behavior in advance of an attempted sexual assault.
Say that woman called for help using a smart home device. 5 News reporter Jose Carranza has new details now from the Washington County prosecutor.
On December 31st, Springdale police were called out to a report of a man wearing nothing but a ski mask who had broken into a home and attacked the woman inside.
He went to the woman's bedroom, he got on top of her in the bed, he was attempting to sexually assault her, he had a roll of duct tape with him.
The victim reported it happened just 10 minutes after her husband left.
The woman called out to her Amazon Alexa device and had it call 911. When she did that, the man ran out of the house and was found nearby by police.
Police say they found Mario Guereca Vasquez in his truck with a pair of women's pink underwear and a phone that had photos of the woman unaware and in her underwear taken from outside the home. Police say a home surveillance camera caught video of Vasquez when investigators showed it to him. They say he admitted to having stalked the woman for a month and eventually wanted to go inside.
There was a strange incident that happened about a week before where a pair of her undergarments was found on a piece of exercise equipment in the front yard, and she just thought it was strange that they were there because she had them in a laundry hamper. She asked her husband said he had nothing to do.
All right, so here, a pretty clear example of that stalking prior to sexual assault. And I'm not criticizing this department. I don't know what was reported and what wasn't and all of that, but just thinking about kind of the story and how it progressed, how they have it in this video clip, it makes me just think about, what if we identified and took seriously some of those strange incidents, right? That my underwear was missing and it was somewhere weird. All of that matters, right? And can also be an indicator that something else is going on here. But here we see that voyeurism, that very much intent to commit sexual assault, and it is planning a sexual assault and it's stalking, right? It's stalking, that kind of surveillance behavior.
Say that.
So stalking for sexual assault can look very scary on its face, right? Like a stranger is peering through the window taking pictures. That most of us would objectively just see as horrifying, right? But it can also look more like this grooming behavior, right? So we often see stalking strategies to groom for sexual violence. And of course, there's different kinds of sexually violent offenders, but there are those repeat rapists who engage in the same kind of MO every time. And so how they groom is this. They're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. That might be our upperclassmen looking at, say, freshman women and saying, who seems kind of naive, who doesn't have a lot of drinking or partying experience. That might be our child sexual predator going online and saying, what child's from maybe a marginalized community or who seems like they've been neglected, right? And then they're going to establish relationships, contact and build trust. You seem really mature for your age. I think I understand you a lot better than your parents do. I think you're really special, right? Through multiple contacts. If they haven't yet, they're going to meet in person and isolate the victim. That could be, hey, come to this party, plying the victim with alcohol, isolating them and committing assault. That could be, come over to the basement, we're going to take some pictures, coerce them into sexual acts, then often contact them after, either to say, thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anybody, or some conflation of the two. So if you think about this kind of grooming behavior under the lens of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Yeah, we have two or more contacts. Is it directed at a specific person? Yeah, they're choosing their victims based on their vulnerability, or their perceived vulnerability, or sometimes their perceived lack of credibility. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Well, yeah, most of us are afraid of sexual violence. Now you may be thinking, but when though? Because if you look at, say, this text message, your victim might say, well, I wasn't scared when they said I was mature for my age. I was really flattered by that, right? But there's no stalking statute that says when fear has to attach, and later events can shape how we view earlier events. So if a victim's saying, yeah, I wasn't scared on day one when I got that text message, but looking back, I realized the whole thing was a setup for my rape, and it all started with this kind of pursuit, and here's the messages, that could still be a stalking case. I mention this because sometimes our adjudication comes down to these moments of consent versus not consent, and your offender might be really happy to share with you, oh no, we had this whole relationship, look, And if you look at that through the lens of grooming and stalking, it can start to look a little bit different, and maybe we can have some accountability there. And also, it's a warning sign, right, of that escalation to sexual assault. This is a more recent study. It's a small study, but I think an important one, saying what it intuitively seems true, right? Which is that a lot of this kind of predation and grooming has moved online. And so this was a study just at one university, but they were finding that about 14% of the rapes that they classified there as acquaintance rapes, it was an initial meetup arranged through a dating app. And there's a high percentage of victims with self-reported mental illness, almost 60%. And these are more violent assaults than typical, increased strangulation, assault and penetrative acts, and victim injuries. And so I think the researchers summarize it well in this quote at the bottom. The researchers propose that sexual predators use dating apps as hunting grounds for vulnerable victims, right? They are stalking in order to assess that victim's potential vulnerability, and then they are committing the assault. And so we see that in person as well as online in a variety of ways, or some combination of both. We also see a lot of intimate image solicitation and exploitation. I've heard this called different things: non-consensual image distribution, revenge porn. We don't love to call it revenge porn because it's not really about revenge and it's not really porn, but I understand that non-consensual intimate image distribution and exploitation can be a lot to say. Um, but it's really that, intimate images or videos that are not shared consensually. And this is often part of a stalking case. This study is a few years old, showing about 16% of our young adult victims report that the stalker shared intimate images or videos of them. Um, I would imagine, though I don't have the new study, that this is only increasing, right? And those videos or images might have at one time been shared consensually. They might have been shared under a power and control dynamic, or they might increasingly, and they are, fabricated entirely. It doesn't really matter. The crime is not that this exists unless someone's fabricating it. The crime is that someone is sharing it without that victim's consent, right? And that non-consensual distribution can be so harmful and so scary, and is often part of a stalking case. And so I often hear a lot of victim blaming around this, where there's the sense of, oh, well, if you didn't want that image shared, you shouldn't have taken the image. Again, nothing the victim did or didn't do is a cause for this kind of behavior. The problem is sharing the image, not that the image exists in the first place. This is a common dating norm, whether we engage in it or like it or whatever or not, whatever our personal preferences or opinions are. It's about the harm is in violating that trust and sharing these images or videos. Um, and I'll come back to that. Increasingly, they are fabricated entirely. So really no one is safe from this. Here's just a recent search I found for a AI porn generator that can do a face swap on a pornography video, undress. If you upload a picture of a woman, it will undress her and create that image. And this is increasingly easy and or free to do. And so I show you this not only to upset you, but also to remind you that there really no one is safe from this, unfortunately. And so we need to be focusing on the crime of distribution. Um, Sometimes that stalking, which could include creating these images, is for some kind of leverage. So they're attaining photos or recordings or gathering information so that they can essentially blackmail that person later. So this was a recent case. Where he had dated these women and then spread sexually explicit image of them outside on their lawns. And so he kept doing this, especially to one victim over and over again. Her neighbors can see this. Everyone who comes to home can see this. It's really humiliating for her. He then created a fake Instagram account pretending it belonged to one of the victims, so impersonating her, and then shared those images to people through the app, so sharing it with third parties. And not only is this traumatic and criminal in its own right, but it's also leverage, right? It's leverage that this offender then used to convince the victim to meet up with him in person, because she's like, let's handle this. I don't want this to keep happening. Let's make amends. And then he pulls a gun and points it at her head. So it is both criminal and traumatic in all the ways and can coerce somebody into that face-to-face meeting. It often doesn't stay just online or what have you. Um, but here it's really strong example of that stalking and sexual violence going together and that misusing intimate images to humiliate someone, to scare someone, and to coerce someone into getting closer to them. There are a lot of resources around non-consensual image distribution, which is great. So here's just a few of them. Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and we are developing more training around non-consensual image distribution. I think for the purposes of our training, I would just say that, when we see these cases, people don't often think stalking, but if our offender planned to do this, if they threatened to share the image, they share the image, and they bragged about it later, I count 3 incidents, not one. This could also be a stalking case, right? That is often part of a stalker's course of conduct. Soliciting third-party sexual violence. So you might have already thought ahead to kind of how this could happen when we have that impersonation that our last offender we talked about engaged in, that unfortunately is very common because all you need to make a profile for someone on a dating website or a social media app is a photo of them and a new email address. And so we often see our offenders impersonating their victims and then soliciting third-party sexual violence, pretending to be them. And so this is a fairly well-known case in which this happened. Just a short news clip here.
Matthew Herrick says for months he couldn't go to the restaurant where he waited tables or his home without men he didn't know approaching him for sex or drugs. Attorneys Carrie Goldberg and Tor Eklund are representing the Manhattan resident in a lawsuit against Grindr, the gay dating app.
This was a life or death matter. They would follow him into the bathroom at work. They wouldn't take no for an answer.
Herrick says his ex created impersonating profiles of him and arranged sex dates with more than 1,400 men. The actor didn't want to speak publicly today,
but I don't have any comment right now.
But he alleges he alerted Grindr to the problem.
All they ever did was send back an auto reply. Thank you for your complaint.
All right, so here we have an extreme example of something that, like I said, unfortunately is quite common, creating a fake profile for someone and then soliciting that third-party sexual violence. And so those stalkers are often concurrently engaging in surveillance. So they're watching, tracking that victim and impersonating them. So they can say, hey, I'm in this coffee shop, I'm wearing the red sweater, come find me. This third party shows up saying, hey, I'm here for what we talked about. And the victim's like, I'm not even on that app. Like, what are you talking about? So you could see how that could lead from anything from ruining reputation and just being really degrading all the way up to sexual violence. And unfortunately, it has. And we see that increasingly. Now, the stalking can also take place after the sexual violence has happened to intimidate the person and or increase the trauma from the assault. And so it's often that intimidation, right? And then the photos or videos, if they were taken during the assault, can also come into play. There is an additional threat. But we see that, you better not tell anyone, or watching them to see, oh, are you going to the Title IX office? What are you doing over there? Sending third parties to do that. So that repeat contact after sexual violence is also stalking. And so because there's a lot of sexually violent stalking behaviors, there's also some potential charges. And so what we tell law enforcement is if you can't charge stalking, charge something. So consider voyeurism, the image creation, sexual assault, indecent exposure. All of these are potential crimes that are also can be part of a stalking case. So like I said, domestic violence makes up a big piece of and when I say domestic violence, I mean dating violence as well. And so regardless of if there's marriage or cohabiting, etc., but that intimate partner violence, right? So that's a big part of our stalking offenders, is about 30-40% of stalking offenders are domestic violence offenders as well. And so I want to focus in on that section here. And point out that the stalking and sexual violence can often happen during the relationship as well. And so often if I hear folks talk about stalking and domestic violence, they'll usually talk about it like this. They'll say something like, okay, it was an abusive relationship. The victim left. from the day that victim left, our abuser began stalking them. And that can totally happen, right? But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, our abuser is texting them constantly, showing up at work, showing up at school, putting a tracker on the car, asking friends and family where they are, threatening them, that's stalking, right? It's intimate partner violence, is what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse or coercive control. And it's stalking. It's both. And it can happen during and or after the relationship. Over half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well, but folks often don't call it stalking then. They call it, again, emotional abuse, digital abuse, and it is those things, but it's also stalking. And we want to know when stalking's happening at any point in an abusive relationship, right? At any kinds of these power and control dynamics that might include stalking behavior, and just about all of them do. Economic abuse, if they're tampering with accounts, if they're insisting on passwords and logins, if they're um, invading that person's privacy, intimidation and threats, right? So we want to know when they're stalking at any point in an intimate partner violence relationship, because while all stalkers can be dangerous, on average, our intimate partner stalkers are the most dangerous, so the most likely to threaten and or harm their victims. 1 in 3 women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. Um, and women who were stalked by a violent partner after obtaining a protective order were over 9 times more likely to be assaulted than women who were not stalked. So we have this, I think, very powerful study of women who were all abused, all had protective orders. Some were stalked afterwards. The women stalked afterwards, 9 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. This doesn't mean the stalking's causing sexual assault, but it does mean that stalking's an indicator, right? That this offender might be more violent and including more sexually violent than our average intimate partner violence offender. This is that same study showing that it's not only sexual assault, but other kinds of harm as well. Everything, including implicit threats and force, like doubles, verbal pressure for sex, sexual degradation, sexual coercion, didn't make it on the slide, but also forced substance use during sex. All of these are significantly higher when there's abuse and stalking, right? And so we want to know when there's that and stalking because, again, it's that indicator. So long story short, too late for you maybe? Ask about co-occurring victimizations. Absolutely ask your stalking survivor about domestic and sexual violence. But if you're working with a survivor who's primarily presenting as a survivor of sexual violence or domestic violence, make sure you ask them about stalking behavior as well, because so often that is missed. And there are consequences to that. We miss a lot of the safety planning and accountability opportunities. I also just want to mention briefly that stalking and trafficking go together. And for folks who work on sex trafficking in particular, this has probably already occurred to you. These same categories, right? When we know that our traffickers are often selecting victims based on their perceived vulnerability and or lack of credibility. And so they are likely to engage in a lot of the behaviors that I already mentioned. Surveillance, they're trying to see, would this be a good person to recruit? Do they seem vulnerable? They might gather information or create situations that they can later leverage. Or now I have these pictures, so you better XYZ or I'll release them. They often ask other people to monitor that victim as well. Invading their life, it could be, I'm going to humiliate you by exposing what you're doing, requiring check-ins, right? You need to text me when you get here, text me when you get there, or show up at these times. It could be gifts or small indulgences as well. You know, they get, let's say, home and there's that package at the door and they know it's from that person. It could be interference, the actual sexual violence, non-consensual image distribution, committing assaults, as well as that intimidation, right? Violence against others in the operation, that's really scary, or threats to do so, and symbols of violence to control. And so when we have more information on the intersection of stalking and sex trafficking on our website, but just to point out as well that just like with sexual assault, especially when we have those perpetrators that are grooming and selecting based on perceived vulnerability, there's often stalking behavior happening there as well. So in all these situations, I think it's really important to name stalking. And you might be like, okay, I get that you care about naming stalking because you're like the stalking lady, okay? Like, why do I care? And I will argue it's important for these reasons. One that I've already mentioned are your charging and prosecution options. Stalking's not always the most strategic charge, but it's also not never the most strategic charge, and it's extremely undercharged. And so let's give our prosecutors that menu of options. It can also be very strategic in the right kind of case, and prosecutors love it when they get it. So I'll tell you why. If you're charging, and I'm generalizing here, right? But if you're charging an incident of, say, domestic violence, the court's generally going to try to limit you to that evening. Did the violence happen, yes or no? If you're charging stalking, you can bring in the whole course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of how terrible this offender is. So common stalker tactics, like they looked through the window, they took these pictures of the person when they weren't looking, or a lot of stalking behaviors I often read about, like a stalker drove 300 miles to carve his ex's name in near trees near her new house. He sent dead animals in the mail. All these other really disturbing things haunt me, the cup of coffee in the car, right? Haunts me, haunts you, haunts judges and juries as well, and paints a much fuller picture of how terrible this offender is. This is not someone with an anger management issue who snapped one day. This is someone who's chosen to engage in a variety of disturbing behaviors again and again. And that's all admissible because we're talking about the pattern of behavior, right? And that's what a stalking charge is. So it's something to consider. Safety planning. When you hear stalking, you want to be thinking, okay, increased risk of sexual violence and physical violence and homicide. You also want to be thinking of that SLY framework. Okay, what's happening in terms of surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation? And there is on our website, it's not ours, but it's something we really recommend. There is a risk assessment specifically for stalking called the SHARP assessment, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile, that basically just asks a bunch of questions. Has this happened? Has that happened? How are we feeling about this? And helps to assess risk. It's free. It only takes like 10 or 15 minutes, again, on our website. And so when you see a stalking case, you might want to think, I should use that specific risk assessment and recognize this here and be thinking about safety planning in all these areas of somebody's life. If we just call it emotional abuse, we kind of miss those red flags. We miss that urgency potentially. And victim empowerment. Even if a victim is like, I don't want to do any of that. Like, I don't want to talk to an officer or sit with you and make a safety plan. Even just to be able to articulate, I'm being stalked and that's a real thing, and I can Google it and something comes up, often goes a long way versus just saying, my ex is being creepy or my neighbor's being weird or, my old friend is doing too much, right? To be able to articulate the victimization. The thing is, I often hear the word stalking used incorrectly. So you might have heard or said something like this, right? Like, I'm totally stalking you on Insta. And yes, you can use social media to stalk, but that doesn't seem to be the true meaning here. And I'm certainly not saying that the casual use of the word stalking causes stalking. It definitely doesn't. But I do think it dilutes the seriousness of the term because we have folks calling it stalking when it's not, and then not calling it stalking when it is. And I'd argue it's a little bit unique to the word stalking at this point. No one's like, oh man, that party was so lit. It's arson, right? If you tell your friend there was arson at my apartment, they're going to be like, dude, there was arson. Are you okay? You got to call the police. There was freaking arson. But if you tell your friend, and we know most victims tell their friends first, right? Hey, I think it might be stalking. You're likely to get this response of like, is it stalking or is it stalking? And that can have a really chilling effect on if our victims take what they're experiencing seriously, and continue to seek help. We also see stalking presented in our media a variety of different ways that are not accurate. So it's often shown as romantic, where it's usually our male protagonists who will stop at nothing to get the girl, and she's already at the airport, so he's there, but the plane took off, so now he's in Paris, and it usually works, and the behavior's rewarded, and he wears her down and does the right thing by really going the distance, right? So we see that a lot in our romantic films and shows, but it's not only shown as romantic, it's also often shown as funny and kind of harmless. If you think about like SpongeBob will not leave Squidward alone, right? And so he just keeps showing up and as an audience member, we're like, oh, he's just this annoying little idiot, so it's fine. There's no real harm shown here. But actually, what he's doing is ignoring boundaries and stalking again and again. It's also shown as heroic quite a bit. So we have our say superheroes got to watch over the city so they can swoop in. Spider-Man's got to watch so he can swoop in and save Mary Jane if she gets in trouble, right? But what do our offenders say, especially our intimate partner offenders? They're likely to say something like, I trust you, I don't trust the world around you. That's why I have to watch you all the time to keep you safe. It's that same kind of patronizing narrative of stalking as heroic, surveillance as love, right? That we often see. Or sometimes it's shown as edgy and sexy, and it's like, ooh, they went there. I'm like, no, who else is going there? One in three women and one in six men, because they are victims of stalking. Um, I think that I'm not saying the media is the problem. I think you can like what you like, and that's fine. It's just recognizing there is a cumulative effect to all this misinformation, right? Um, I like to see stalking in a horror movie because I'm like, yeah, that's right. It's scary. That's accurate. I think it's actually a lot more dangerous when we consistently show stalking behaviors as romantic, funny, or heroic, because the cumulative effect is that it creates a fantasy version of stalking. And the fantasy of stalking is that the stalker is an attractive stranger or like a meet cute. They have good intentions, usually romantic. At worst, they're awkward or misguided, and it's that, ugh, there they are again, kind of like SpongeBob. And at best, we feel really seen and chosen, and like this person really loves this person, the victim or the target. And so at worst, it's annoying. At best, it's really special. We feel really seen and chosen. And that's just not the reality of what stalking is. In reality, stalkers are generally people we know that we don't want anything to do with. They have different motivations, but they generally want to scare their victims and delight in doing so. They're engaging in a variety of disturbing, bizarre, and violent behaviors, including rape and homicide, and our victims are terrified. They're relocating, they're changing their names. They can never feel safe again. And so when I hear folks say something like, oh, it's just stalking, I don't think there's any one reason for that, but I often think to myself, oh, you're responding to the fantasy of stalking, not the reality of stalking. And that fantasy exists, that's fine, but that makes it all the more urgent for us to kind of be the voice as folks in this field of what that reality is, because there's very little counter message out there. If you think about it, if you watch an episode of TV right now that shows, say, sexual assault, usually something pops up at the end that's like, hey, if you've experienced this, call this number. We don't have that for stalking. So we just have the misinformation with no counterbalance of here's the reality of this and what it looks like and where you should go for help. So very big picture on responding to victims. Victims cope with stalking different ways, right? Just like victims cope with all kinds of trauma, including sexually violent trauma, different ways. Um, these are all normal human reactions, but some might be more or less helpful in dealing with the stalker. And so for some victims, their instinct is to move against the stalker. Um, so, oh, you're stalking me? Cool, you're going to prison, right? And so they're going to be very cooperative with law enforcement. You're going down, you are not getting away with this, right? And they're going to talk about it and they're going to try to bring that stalker down. You have others move inward. Ooh, I don't want to embarrass anyone. I don't want to cause a whole thing. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. And so they might become really isolated and not talk about what's going on at all. You have many move away, so that can include physically relocating, but also other acts that create distance. So blocking that person on social media, changing routes to and from work or school, anything that creates that space. You have others move towards the offender to try to appease them. Okay, they want to talk every day. I'll call them once a week. Trying to negotiate with that person and kind of keep their enemies closer. And you have some victims move outward, move to folks like you who could help, which is wonderful. But by the time they've done that, they've probably already tried some of these other things. And so it's worth asking them, what have they tried already? What's working? What's not working? Another piece I want to address is this move away advice. So this is frequently advice given to stalking victims where they're told create distance, right? So they're often told cease contact, block the person on everything. Um, and that can be helpful because it creates that line in the sand, right? But it may or may not be that realistic or helpful. So For example, let's say I'm stalking you and I'm old school, I love to call you, okay? So I'm just calling on the phone, and eventually you're like, I am so over Dana stalking me, I'm gonna change my freaking number. So, because you took that move away advice, I'm gonna block her. I'm gonna change the number. So eventually I call and I get that this number is no longer in service. Am I, the stalker, gonna be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking today and become a productive member of society? No, I'm already stalking you. I know where you work. I know where you live. I know your Instagram handle. I'm just going to find another way to you, and I might actually escalate my behavior. And so a lot of times victims know that, and that's why they don't create those blocks, even though they're often told to. And then they're blamed for, well, if you really didn't want to talk to them, you should have blocked them. But that's kind of it's that keep your enemies closer, right? And knowing, and a victim put it to me like this once. They're like, if you're being hunted by someone, don't you want to know where they are? Kind of hard to argue with that. If our victim blocks the offender, maybe the offender can't see them. They also can't see the offender. So they're not going to get that text message saying, I'm coming over so the victim can leave. Or see on Instagram, oh, they're out of town this weekend. Maybe I can relax a little bit. And so these, again, this advice isn't to say never tell them to create distance, because it can be helpful. And the reason that it's helpful is because it can stop that reinforcement, because stalkers do see any contact as reinforcing their behavior. So if the stalker calls 100 times and the victim picks up and says, stop it, I hate you, tomorrow they're calling 101 times because that was a win for that stalker, right? But again, that's not always possible or realistic, and can actually escalate the danger to the victim, because now they really have no idea where that stalker is. And also that move towards behavior can sometimes be in the victim's best interest. And so, for example, we had a case where it came out the victim had called the stalker at 2 a.m. and they talked for hours. So of course the defense is like, well, how scared can she be? If she's so scared, why is she calling him? And we asked the victim, and the victim said, yeah, I knew he got off work at the bar at 2 a.m. So I could hear him get in his car, drive home, and fall asleep, and I could talk him down and reassure him. So I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows, wake my kids up again. That's perfectly reasonable safety planning. And so it's really both. Recommend no contact because of that reinforcement, and realize that may not be possible. Now, if there's hard and fast rules or practices in your area about, say, a protective order being dropped if the victim reaches out to the offender, make sure your victim knows that. But often victims feel like they've done something wrong and like this should be a secret. And that's not helpful for anyone, right? That's not helpful for their safety planning or for our criminal justice system. So just recognize this is not always as easy as it seems. And I understand it's complicating, right? It's much cleaner if they seize contact and draw that line. It shows that resistance and persistence, right? I resisted, I changed, I blocked them on everything, and then they found my new account. And they made a new account and contacted me anyways. That's really helpful to know. It shows our offender's intent, right? It shows their persistence, but did that make the victim safer? Maybe, maybe not. And so it's just a little more complex. Incident and behavior log, very helpful. We have these again on our website, I think in 10 languages now. Very succinct, because we often tell victims document, but we don't always tell them how or what's important. And so the date, time, what happened, where did it happen? A lot of jurisdictional issues can come up in our stalking cases because it's often about following. So I know we have folks from different parts of the state, but if you're near, say, Washington, and so you have your victim goes to Seattle for the weekend and then comes back to Portland where they live, and they go visit their parents, somewhere else, that could be 3 different stalking jurisdictions, right? 3 different statutes even. So you want to know where it happened. And because stalkers often cross county lines, it can be confusing for victims to know exactly where it took place. If technology was used, what platform? Because getting evidence from Snapchat is different than Instagram, is different than Apple, is different than Google, right? So we want to know that. If there are any witnesses, their information, and if evidence is attached. And, talk to victims about the best ways to save evidence. It's not intuitive for most folks. A lot of people, when they get an upsetting text message, they might want to delete it because they don't want to think about that whenever they open their phone. but instruct them to keep it, to take that screenshot, to slide their thumb over to show the date and time, all those kinds of things. And if they made a report to anyone, if it's law enforcement, great. Let's get their badge number and their county, because again, sometimes it's different across. Victims often say, well, I called the police. And then when you drill down, they called different offices or maybe didn't even talk to police. Victims say, I've called the police, and you drill down and it's like, you talked to that bouncer at the club. That could still be a good witness though, right? They were still scared enough they told an authority figure. So that's good to know, but it'll help you get a better sense of who's sharing information and who's not. And I will say, because stalking, again, is that pattern of behavior, they might indeed be calling the same office every time and have a different responding officer. So when that person gets that call out of the blue of, there's a cup of coffee in my car, they might kind of roll their eyes. But for a victim to be able to say, this is just the latest, and here's who I've talked to, and here's all the things that have happened, can go a long way. This is burdensome for victims. It's unfair. It's a lot of work, but it's helpful because these incidents add up. But they only add up if we do the math. And so definitely something I highly recommend. When we're working with stalking victims, of course, connecting them with safety for their physical health, mental health, emotional health, sexual health, right? Recognizing that stalkers are often persistent and show up across locations. They're at work, they're at school, they're at home, they're at the parents' home, right? And so really thinking about safety planning in all of those locations, as well as through technology, and trying to anticipate as much as is realistic how we think our offender will react when certain steps are taken. That advocacy and recognizing, again, there are very few stalking specific advocates. So it really falls to us to be that advocate for that victim, and to whatever your official role is, say, not everyone gets how urgent this is, but I do, and help walk them through our system to document everything. The documentation log can help with that, as well as that sharp assessment I mentioned earlier. I'll put that in the chat as well. And support, right? And our system, it's often really hard to know. People often don't know what's available. I've had so many survivors say, well, I wish I knew I was eligible for, say, victims compensation or something like that. So whether it's housing or health services or any variety of other thing that our victim might need, connecting them to that support. And considering things like, can they come into shelter if it's a non-intimate partner offender, right? Having policies on that and knowing what is available to support our stalking survivors, and then how can we increase that? A couple of resources to help you do so. Again, I know I keep plugging our website, but we're proud of it. Includes infographics, more on the behaviors. And so I'd say, hey, if you're doing next Sexual Assault Awareness Month, let's say you're tabling, why not have an infographic on stalking and sexual violence as well, or share the video I showed you, etc. So really keep this year round and share the information with your team as part of education on sexual violence. And our website, you know it, you love it. Practitioner guides, training modules, victim resources, webinars. This is my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention, for your participation, and for your time today. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, think about this, consider that. Have you realized this, right? But you're the ones who are actually on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done. So, and you already have big jobs without adding the stalking piece on, and I'm aware of that. So truly thank you for the work that you do and for your attention. And don't hesitate to reach out for further training, resources. We're here to help. That's what we're here to do. So we want to hear from you. And again, we're usually free of charge to do more training, do anything that y'all might want. And again, just kind of my plea that I know I've already made a little bit, but they're just after this hour and a half, you now know more about stalking than most people in our field. That is the reality of the situation. And so when we're looking for someone to help these survivors, it really has to be you and whatever role you play, saying, I know not everyone gets the urgency here, but I do, and doing whatever it takes to help walk them through this imperfect system. So thank you again for your commitment and for all that you do for victims and survivors.